When you ask people what edge compute is, you get a range of answers. Cloud compute and DevOps with devices and sensors, with semiconductors outside the data center, including connectivity, AI, and a security strategy. It's a stew of technologies that's powering our vehicles, our buildings, our factories, and more. It's also filled with fascinating people that are passionate about their tech, their story, and their world. I'm your host, Pete Bernard, and the Excelsior Show makes sense of what edge compute is, who's doing it, and how it can transform your business and you. So let's get started. Starting to spend more money on stuff, so that's good.
Especially if it starts with AI.
Oh, yeah, it's like insanity. Because everyone's trying to do something there, right?
I've been surprised at how fast this area is taken off. I did not expect the adoption to be this fast.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is it's so accessible for the layperson to just go to a ChatGPT website or whatever and just start doing stuff. Start. The APIs are there. I mean, it's all there. And so people are very quickly integrating it and doing POCs and doing product. As long as NVIDIA and folks and like Intel can make chips, they'll keep running these workloads, I guess. I don't know. I don't know if there's any upper bound limit. Actually, I was talking to a company that's in the power business. This is an interesting area. Power is really a big deal. That could be one of the gating factors, is just electricity and getting power to these kind of data centers and mini data centers and edge sites just to run this stuff. The public grid in and of itself is inherently limited, right, in terms of how much power it can provide and the wait times to get hooked up with power. So that may end up being one of those things that actually inhibits more deployment of some of these things, is just plain old electricity. But we'll see.
Yeah, I just joined a board couple weeks ago, and I've been working with this company for a long time, but they're an edge-based data center that's hydrogen cooled.
Oh yeah.
So hydrogen powered.
Yeah.
And so fully hydrogen powered, edge-based, they can be up and running from the time they get the permit. They can be up and running with, customers in 30 to 60 days.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. And so I think like the self-powered data center, or, and I think for some of these big companies, Fortune 50s, that need, frankly, kind of almost like on-prem data centers or near-prem data centers, they can't go off the public grid, right? So they have to be more self-sufficient on power. You can't just ask your local utility for like 400 megawatts, please. I'll be like, come back in a decade. And we'll help you out. So the self-powered data center, hydrogen powered. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think there's it's a fun space right now. It's
yeah. We're running into a lot of interesting upper bounds of things going on, which is kind of cool. By the way, let me just do an appropriate introduction here.
Sure.
So I'm going to rewind a little bit, and I'll edit and splice this all together appropriately. But so let me officially welcome you, Stacey Shulman from Intel, to the show, the Excelsior Show, and it's great to have you here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Maybe you can give us a little blurb on your background and sort of what's been keeping you busy lately.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll start with current day at Intel. I run all the people-focused businesses. So whether in industry, that covers healthcare, life sciences, retail, banking, hospitality, corporate collaboration, casino gaming, education, anything that involves people directly, for the most part, sits under my group at Intel. And we focus primarily at the edge, or, outside of a data center. So on premises, at the school, in the hospital, in the retail store, it tends to be where we put most of our focus and attention. So I came to Intel about 6 years ago, and before that, I spent most of my career either as a CIO for large manufacturing and retail organizations, or before that, building commercial software products for those types of organizations. So I've been on every side of the value chain, in every part of the value chain. It's been a fun career.
It's kind of like there's the use tech part of the world, and then there's the make tech part of the world, and you've been in both worlds.
And the sell tech part of the world.
So, of course, yes, I got to sell it too. But no, I noticed you did a stint at Levi Strauss. You did a stint at Levi's and American Apparel. So you were definitely like in the heart of the retail world for a little while.
Yeah, especially in the vertically integrated apparel space. That's where I probably spent most of in the fashion space. Even the products that I was creating, the software products I was creating, was primarily for the luxury vertically integrated, manufacturing companies.
Yeah.
So that's where I spent most of my time.
Interesting. So were you in San Francisco for Levi's? Headquarters Levi? Okay, cool.
Yeah, worked out of the office there. A great location. It's amazing working for a company that 160-year-old company that established the category, literally invented the category of denim.
Exactly.
And jeans, and has been the leader of that category since it invented it.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting kind of ride.
Yeah. I was thinking about because I'm working with a lot of small companies now too. And, big companies have their pluses and minuses. There's a lot of scale there. And, but also there's the brand equity is kind of one of those X factors, working with companies that have a lot of brand equity. I mean, you're working for Intel now, we were talking about Microsoft, and there's a lot of value in having companies with some brand equity in the game. And I think that's one of the things always with smaller companies is they struggle with that. They have they've invented this new mousetrap and it's fantastic, but no one's heard of them, and who wants to bet on them, bet their business on them. So I think it's interesting. Like the equity part is always valuable, I think.
I think it is. I also think it's a weight at the same time, and I've watched these large companies. I'll use Levi's as an example because it's a public example and they've admitted to it. But when you're the category leader and you have brand equity, sometimes you get complacent. You don't fight like that startup has to fight with all of their might, with all of their heart, and they've got to put everything into it. And, innovation becomes more theatrics than reality.
Right. Well, especially
so I think there's something to be said for that scrappy company that's fighting. And I think these big companies need to learn. We need to learn a lot from that.
Well, it's the innovator's dilemma, right? It's hard to disrupt yourself. Right. Much easier to be disrupted. I remember I've probably worked for 5 or 6 companies now, and most of the companies I'd worked for prior to Microsoft, no one had ever heard of. So it was always going to go home for Thanksgiving and, your uncle's like, I've never heard of them, and then when I worked for Microsoft, they're like, oh yeah, we know Microsoft.
Yeah.
So
don't worry. I still get that for Intel. Like, who's Intel? I'm like, I'm not doing the long thing for you, but you would know the song. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say, yeah. Of course, when I told people I work for Microsoft, the next question is, can you help me fix my computer? That was
right. Yeah. I still get that.
Something with Windows. But, it's there's always that tension of disruption and innovation and, brand equity. And I was talking to someone about the automotive space, a very hot space right now, right? And so you've got these, big giant companies like the GMs and the Fords, and then lots of disruption coming up from underneath and from all sides. And how do they, leverage that brand equity to stay on top, but at the same time, do something innovative and potentially cannibalistic in some cases, right? So,
well, that's the hard part is how do you do that without alienating your existing customer base? And I think that's the struggle. Is it does become a weight because you have all of this legacy that you've got to not ignore, and you've got to bring that customer base along with you on your innovation journey. And not everyone's ready for that innovation journey. And so you've got to make some calculated decisions on, do you leave people behind? And if you do, who and why, and how do you bring them back later? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that was like the who move your cheese lesson. I think going back to Microsoft, there was a very famous case study there, right? When Microsoft redesigned Windows 8, took away the start button, they tried to kind of disrupt themselves and kind of maybe went a little too far and left some people behind. Everyone's like, where's the start button? How do I do this thing? And then there was a lot of, obviously they brought it back with Windows 10, things like that. But anyway, long story there. Lots of examples of moving the cheese. I was going to ask you a question. So the show is about edge computing. And one of the questions I ask guests are, if you were at we talk about Thanksgiving dinner or wherever, a cocktail party, and people are like, what is edge computing? How do you address that? How do you try to explain edge computing to somebody that's doesn't understand what you're talking about?
I think I did a little bit of that in my intro, right? When I talk about my group, I rarely say, I'm in the edge computing group, which I am. I'm in the network and edge computing group. Yeah. And what I generally tell people is it's anything outside of the data center. And most people kind of understand that. Now, that's not totally perfect, but it's pretty close. It's pretty close. When we get into, when people ask about, most people don't need examples of that, but generally the first reaction, depending on their level of sophistication, is, well, isn't that going away? And I'm like, let's walk into a hospital for a second. And I want you to tell me, just thinking about walking through a hospital, how many computers you see. That's edge computing. Or when you're in an airport and you look at a digital billboard, that's edge computing. Right. And, when you're at point of sale paying for something in a retail store, that's edge computing. Or you're checking in at a kiosk in an airport, that's edge computing. So it's everywhere. And, I don't think it's going to go away. I think it's going to continue to grow. And I actually think things are going to push out to the edges more.
Yeah. Well, no, there's definitely a gravitational pull to the edge. I guess one of the things that I distinguish for folks too is sort of like, originally, everything was on-prem, right? And then, maybe originally, actually, everything was centralized in mainframes, but we're going too far back. But let's say everything was on-prem. Well, I'll go back a few decades. But then there's this big, lift and shift migration, right? It's like, I can take these workloads. Instead of having a Dell under my desk, I can move these workloads to the cloud. And there was that whole big shift to the cloud. And then people were like, but still, obviously, as you said, there's lots of workloads and scenarios where you need stuff, you need compute, like right where the action is. And so now and in between there, we had IoT, which was kind of a small signal sent occasionally to the cloud to measure and kind of figure out what's going on. But now edge computing is compute where the action is, complementing some sort of cloud capability as well to create some sort of continuum between workloads in the cloud, workloads where the action is, and potentially even workloads at sensors that are going beyond that space. And so that's kind of the new phase where it's part of a continuum of compute from the cloud to the edge to sensors, as opposed to one or the other, right? Yep. So
agreed. And I think we're going to see, we like to talk about the distributed compute and where, we saw those trends of trying to go to mainframes. And I think a lot of that trend, in the 60s, 70s, early 80s of mainframes, the edge still didn't have a lot of compute proliferated out there.
Right.
And then we got into the client server world, and there's more out there. And, we haven't really gone away from client server at the edge. Like we can call it all kinds of fun names, but realistically, we're still at client server days at the edge for the most part, except for the IoT era where everyone said, well, just connect that device to the, direct to the cloud. Right. And then, except for these things, then you'll connect it direct into your on-prem stuff, which is the server.
Right.
And then we kind of go into that hybrid model. But I fully believe that we're going to continue distributing out workloads out to the edges and decentralize.
Well, now we have more orchestration capabilities, right? So now we can orchestrate workloads, and we can run them on the cloud, or we can run them on the kind of metro edge. We can run them on the on-prem edge. We can run them on even cameras and sensors, right? So once you have more orchestration around it, now you can sort of treat it as kind of one holistic system, ideally. That's what the PowerPoint tells me, but the actual deployment usually gets a little gnarlier than that. But hey, I was going to also ask you about another thing that I was seeing, and I think Intel's always been sort of on the cutting edge of this too, is I think Intel was recently talking about IPUs, so infrastructure processing units, and someone was asking me about IPUs and GPUs and NPUs, and one of the things that's been happening, and this is a long trend, is we all started with these kind of core compute units, but then quickly they say yesterday's software is tomorrow's hardware, right? So these workloads are like, well, we actually need processing units. We need semiconductors that can actually compute these very specific workloads like GPUs or neural processing units and NPUs. And so now Intel has the infrastructure processing unit for managing packets and other sort of network infrastructure. And so that seems to be sort of the next frontier, is more PUs, I guess, for some of these workloads.
I guess I think like what's old is new, right? I mean, we if you look at compute, everything was purpose built for a long time. Mm-hmm. And then, Intel comes in with more heterogeneous, can compute anything. And that's not the right answer always either. And then everyone starts putting accelerators on top of that. And so, but we've always had FPGA, well, not always, but, we've had FPGAs and ASICs and EA6 and those sorts of things for a while. Yeah. And GPU and, we've had math coprocessors. We've always had some chip that did a special function that was an add-on, an accelerator to other things. And I think that this time is no different. I'd hate for the pendulum to swing, though. I don't believe it's going to swing in the opposite direction where everything is, fit for purpose kind of compute. I don't believe that it will go there because it's just not efficient.
It doesn't scale.
Yeah. And so, but I do think that there's a need for more targeted accelerators and for architectures that allow for plug and play for accelerators, or for even, software-based accelerators that can turn on and off functionality or repurpose parts of the chip to be able to do that. And so that's Stacey's opinion on how that world is going.
Well, I mean, it's kind of getting back to the edge compute thing. You gave some examples. There's, the edge compute world is a pretty heterogeneous world. There's lots of things going on out there. You said medical equipment and retail equipment and point of sale and machinery, like manufacturing. And so all of these things, they don't fall into a single bucket, right? They're all optimized and doing workloads that are very specific and fit for purpose. And so in some cases, they will need some acceleration, very specific workloads. And so that's where hardware and silicon and semiconductors can add a little oomph, or necessary oomph, to drive the right sort of price power sort of connection there. So yeah, no, I think we'll see more of it, but like you said, there'll be a finite number of them. Hopefully it won't get too prolific. Keeps the software developers' jobs interesting, right? To kind of make sure that they're getting the right code to write on the right
we'll just put more abstraction layers in, right?
Yeah, of course, you can always do that. More low code, no code, efficient. Drag and drop. Yeah, right. And then of course, then the silicon developer is kind of pulling their hair out because they've built this beautiful chip that has like 93 abstraction layers on top of it.
Yeah, well, then we get back to general purpose anyways at that point.
Exactly. So. Yeah. Oh, one of the things I was going to ask you about too is around. So the podcast is about edge computing, but not just feeds and speeds and gates and all that good stuff, but also about the business in edge computing and business model innovation. We were talking earlier about self-disruption or cannibalization, or how do you disrupt? And one of the ways you disrupt is just kind of going at the business in a different way. And how do you see like edge computing and some of this innovation happening in some of these verticals, like disrupting business models?
Yeah. Well, you'll probably no one will ever hear me talk about speeds and feeds ever. I'm a terrible silicon salesperson. And, but, I'd say, so I spend my life talking about this question right here, which is what are the use cases that matter in the industry and in the industries that I come across. I think that, on the question of what will disrupt, these industries out there, I don't know that it's a new thing. I think it's just an acceleration of an existing thing, which is under the category of automation. And we can insert AI metaphors here. We can use AI terms here, but I like to simplify it in terms of automation. And when I look at new types of automation, is it automation for feeding the right information at the right time to the person who's standing in front of a customer? So there's automation that way. The automation of the creative process. We're seeing generative AI do a really good job of really automating the creative process and adding automation into that process and taking friction out for the creators. I think that's the creative community is kind of going through a renaissance with it right now.
And, I guess it's a renaissance, something like that.
It's not the industrial
depending on who
revolution,
you talk to,
right? But it is kind of a renaissance for the creatives. If you're talking to people, on the looking to automate more, for optimizing, it's a little different. But for the creative community, I'm seeing it as a huge unlock for them for being able to kind of have a ping pong partner that's a creative ping pong partner to kind of bounce ideas off of and figure out kind of formulate some of their thoughts and whatever. And all of the kind of ways that it automates that in the creative community, I've found that to be really interesting. And so I kind of think through like, all right, if the creative community is getting unlocked right now and creativity is getting unlocked, what does that mean for business? And I'm one of those optimists that believe, if creativity is unlocked, it always does great for business. What that will be, it's hard to say because the space is moving faster than I thought it would.
We were talking about that. No, I think you're right. I mean, it is interesting to see how, not to totally rat hole into generative AI, which every conversation seems to these days, but what is the impact on content and creativity? And one could argue, I don't know if you listen to Scott Galloway, he had a whole interesting podcast talking about content and some of the numbers and economics around content, especially from the streamers. If you look at it, like there just aren't enough people like in the world to consume the content that's currently being created by these streaming platforms. Right. There's already so much content being created. I mean, you and I are probably the same thing. Like it's just too much to watch and keep up with. And so now we'll have generative AI creating more content faster. And I'm sure humans will be involved at some point. But, talking about upper bounds, we may reach an upper bound of just not being able to consume all the generative AI content being created. But anyway, that's my rat hole on generative AI.
But I think we're at those upper bounds anyways. And I guess I look at it a little differently. There's content. There's always been tons of content. There's libraries filled with content. And there has been for a long time. To me, it's more about curated content and how do I best get to the content that I need. And so I don't see it necessarily as, I know some people see it as a content generator. Got it. And it does a fine job at that. But I also see it more importantly as a curator for us, based on our needs. You can't get that from Google. You can't get that from any kind of search engine today, really curating content for you that is based on your context and your intention of what you're trying to do, accomplish.
Yeah. Right? No, I agree with that. I think that's, I'll give you an interesting anecdote in this, anytime we talk about sort of AI helping people curate experiences, there's always this kind of, someone throws the anecdote on the table. So I'll throw mine on the table. So, I uploaded my resume to, I don't know, it was like Indeed.com or one of those things. So in my background, I used to work at Phoenix Technologies. I was a BIOS developer and I used to write an assembly code. And so I think it's on my resume somewhere that I have assembly or whatever in there. So lo and behold, I get this job, they send you an email saying, you would be great for this job. And it was a job for like putting together playgrounds, like assembling playgrounds, basically. And it was like somewhere on the East Coast, and it was like $20 an hour or something like that.
You did assembly, so
I know, and I'm like, well, how did they possibly think this made sense for me? And then I saw the word assembly, and I was like, aha, they must have like scraped this word from my resume and somehow decided assembling playgrounds is the same thing. But anyway, I digress. That's just it's.
Or your search history has playground equipment in it recently.
Yeah, not recently. No, my kids haven't used playground equipment in a long time. But no, I certainly would love an agent or some co-pilot, to use a Microsoft term, to help me navigate content and find stuff I'm interested in. I mean, Netflix does an okay job, but even then I don't have enough time. But that's a whole other discussion. Business model innovation. The other thing that I saw, and I'm curious what you think about this too, this is kind of like a meta trend, but like a lot of the, I don't call it SaaSification, but the as a serviceification of tech. You could even argue as a serviceification of life. People are getting gigs and Ubers and other things everything's happening now on demand, and people are expecting to pay for their software and kind of their tech on demand as well, which is kind of hard when you're in the hardware business where you have real CapEx costs and inventory, and you can't just sort of take your product and divide by 12 and say, now it's a subscription, right? So it's like, I think one of the things that'll be happening, I think there's a little bit of a productive tension going on, is how do we move things into more of an as a service model that have traditionally been more kind of single purchase. And I don't think we've kind of crossed that chasm yet, but I think it's getting there. I don't know.
I think so too. And I would challenge how people are thinking about it in some ways. I think there's this assumption early days in the as a service that the reason that the big value of it was the financial model of it.
The OpEx, CapEx.
Yeah. And I've heard this argument, OpEx, CapEx, so many times. And like, that's great unless you're underspending your CapEx budgets. And I think the trend is really about flexibility and the ability to, have something up and running quickly. Right? So I think so if we look at it from the lens of being nimble and being responsive to the needs that I have right now, I think then we look at it a little differently. So it might not be that somebody's asking for a creative financing model for their hardware, which is essentially what a lot of these like hardware as a service models turn out to be.
Right.
It might just be that they're really asking for the simplicity to be able to manage it differently. And so I always encourage companies, like, let's go solve the actual root of the problem, which is speed of innovation. And, if it's really a creative financing and it's really a financial instrument, there's ways to solve that the tech industry doesn't really need to. It's not a technical solve to go solve a financial instrument.
Right.
But the tech solve is, it gets harder. The easy solve is, well, let me just charge you differently. The hard solve is, well, let me make it easy for you to manage those things, stand them up, provision them, get them onto your network, make sure they're secure. That's the hard solve. And that's what I kind of push people to, like, let's talk about that hard solve and why it's needed right now more than ever and how it will be used in industries. So that's always my pushback on the hardware as a service. Now, the other as a service stuff, I think it still stands. Most of it is still, we gravitate towards that because it's just so much the perception that it's much easier and much more accessible to get started with.
Right. Yeah. The speed, like you said, the speed and there's flexibility there too. So part of it is if I'm bringing up a whole system, let's say to count cars in the parking lot of my local fried chicken place, then I want the flexibility to improve that, as the hardware gets better without having to rewrite my code. So there's some portability issues too, that people, going back to our abstraction layers comments, right? How do I make sure I'm not hard coding my parking lot system into like this camera that was built like 15 years ago or something? Right. So yeah, it has a lot of impact when you try to move to an as a service model in real life, like with actual physical goods. But it'll be interesting to see how that kind of plays out. I think it's something that every tech company needs to think about, is like they have to have some kind of way of addressing that. Like you said, customers have those needs. You can't just go at them with, your business model and say, take it or leave it. So,
well, I'm seeing not just tech companies. I mean, we saw this in retail, with rentals, in cars with leases. I mean, you see it in every industry that went into kind of the, I'm not fully committed to the long term with this thing, but I definitely want to use it for a certain amount of time until, that's I want to get the value out of it for this amount of time. And I think that, the tech is following that same trend.
Yeah. Well, I mean, music streaming is kind of canonical example, right? It's like people just used to buy albums and, well, I guess they do buy albums now again, but they used to buy music, then they stream music. Now they're buying vinyl, but whatever. Yeah. It's kind of the same thing. It's interesting to see that. And the kind of, when I talk to companies about business model innovation, is how do they build that kind of flexibility into their business model from the beginning and try to meet the customers where they're at. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. A lot of interesting things going on in Intel these days. I mean, we can go on and on, but I don't know if you've read that book, Chip War.
I have not read it.
Oh, you should read the book. What's the name of the author? But yeah, it's a great history of semiconductors. I had that as kind of required reading on my team. And it was like really from the very beginning, and obviously Intel and Noyce and all these folks. And then the evolution of that, and Intel as obviously a pioneer in the space, and also as a fab. And a lot of people don't necessarily understand the distinction between a fab versus a chip designer, and Intel's actually both. Yeah. And so, it's a fascinating space. And so I can imagine, you mentioned, Levi's having this 160-year history and being a leader. I think Intel's as close to the closest thing we have to a Levi's, I think, in the chip space.
Yeah, great. Yeah. No, it was the parallels were crazy when I came over to Intel in between, even just like the internal mechanisms that were there, that get put in place when you are the category leader. I assume it was similar at Microsoft.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, at Microsoft, you could definitely see the historical patina on our processes and our buildings in some cases, right. Which is fantastic from a historical perspective. And there's, a lot of strength in that. And like you said, sometimes some challenges too, but no, it's always interesting to see what comes out of Intel these days. And, no shortage of opportunities and challenges as well. So,
well, I think that the thing with these legacy companies, these heritage companies, I would say, the Microsofts, the Intels, the Levi's, companies like that, is, even though everyone likes to see the leader fall a little bit, it seems to be like the general thing is it doesn't matter if
root for the underdog,
team. Exactly. So everyone likes to see a little bit of that, but at the same time, no one wants to see the leader fail. And, right. Especially when it's such a rich part of the heritage of a country and I don't think I'm overstating that, right? If I talked about Levi's even in that context, you see pictures of people sitting at the fall of the Berlin Wall in Levi's. There's just such rich stories and heritage, and you see that at Intel, you see that at companies like Microsoft, and so honoring that heritage, but at the same time pushing it and challenging it, and shaking it sometimes, trying to get it to be less complacent is part of what we've all got to do.
Thanks again, Stacey, for joining me here, and our listeners. I really appreciate your insights. Yeah, no, it was great talking to you again as usual, and stay well.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks for joining us today on the Excelsior Show. Please subscribe and stay tuned for more, and check us out online about how you can scale your edge compute business.